So it's finally happening. We're going to be teaching through these videos, and in so much as they bless you, I hope that you receive them and that you're able to spread them about as you see fit. One of the things that's most interesting in terms of how the church has developed over the years is that we got really, really good at arguing. We became lawyers in courtrooms trying to justify various perspectives on God and about the things of God and his character and so on and so forth. And now we've gone past the point of discussion into realms of just being bigots or belittling people. Examples, no, we won't give examples. We will simply say that you probably know or have even just in your mind caricatures of what Christians look like. Because a lot of us can be... I'm not supposed to curse anymore. They can be poop heads in terms of how they try and exemplify Jesus. So the starting place for how we want to deal with that is to kind of work on how we communicate. And because we're going to be doing like group discussions via Skype and Google Hangouts and all those things, we want to make sure that we are understood as far as what we expect of people when they're communicating in those situations. So the first thing that we need to talk about then is what a logical basis is. Logic is reasoning that is like controlled or conducted with a strict alignment with validity, or being able to validate the perspective. An established logical base is basically the concrete that's laid in the foundation of the home, the walls being the ideas that you build up on that first core thought. So for instance, the logical basis that I hold in relation to God, understanding I'm not trying to prove God with this logical basis, it's my logical basis about God. For God to be God in the Judeo-Christian sense, he must be all-powerful, he must be infinite, he must be sovereign, he must be love. And I don't mean he must be loving, I mean he must be love, because he defines himself as love. He said, I am love. So when we talk about any of the other things that God is in terms of just or righteous, those are all true. There's nothing wrong with them. But God defined his essence, like the core of his being, what he actually is love. So for God to be all-powerful, he must be infinite, because to have all power means you can overcome any variable or any set of consequences or contextual actions that you come up against. I mean, you've got other statements in the Bible like, 1,000 years is like a day and a day is like 1,000 years in relation to God, which suggests he's outside of time. But to be infinite, like, if he's infinite, then he's also outside of all the traditional constraints of dimensionality as we understand them, mass and space and time, etc. And if he's infinite and he's all-powerful, he's also perfect. And if he's perfect, then he never contradicts himself. I don't mean he's incapable of it. I mean he never does. And I know a lot of you who are maybe less fond of the Bible or Christians are now saying to yourselves, oh, well then we don't believe in God because we see contradictions. But what I would suggest to you is if God is perfect and the Bible is divinely inspired, then any contradictions that are perceived must only be perceived and not actual. Now, we're not talking about like little things like the number of angels that appeared outside the tomb when Jesus was resurrected, or any of these smaller, more detail-oriented pieces of those stories. And the reason why we're not is because no ancient literature stands up to that kind of scrutiny. When you take multiple eyewitness accounts, you get different versions of the same events, and that's what you're looking for when you examine ancient testimonies. The point is, you can have physical evidence, you can have event-based evidence. There was a great battle fought on this piece of land. You're going to find corpses and higher iron and copper content in the soil because of the blood that was spilled. You're going to find various pieces of weaponry or broken armor. And that's all fine. That's physical evidence as it's related. But when you deal with eyewitness accounts, as in the soldiers that were there on the battlefield, each one of them is going to come down with different stories. They will have looked at the exact same event, but will have different perspectives on it. So we do that with God fairly constantly. We will look at an event, or we'll look at the Bible, and we'll read all these different things into it. And that's a problem in some really specific ways. What we do in that context is called eisegesis. An eisegesis is when you perceive text, but you ignore the context in which it's presented, and you read into it your own ideology, your own perceptions. You make the text say what you want it to say. And that's the opposite of accurate scholarship, especially when it applies itself to the Bible, but also just any ancient text, period. Doesn't matter whether you're reading Marcus Aurelius or Josephus or Mark. The point is, when you take all of the context out of and only read it through the lenses of your own cultural context, your own experiences and past understandings of God, you're going to have a bad time. You're not going to come up with what is actually there. You're going to come up with a version of what you thought you read. The opposite of eisegesis is exegesis, and to exegete a text is to read it in context. What you are looking for is what it meant to the people of the day, why it was said the way that it was said, what were the allegories actually referring to, and then what would they have meant contextually, both to the people who were speaking and the people who were listening. So if God never contradicts himself and the Bible is true, then when Hebrews 1:3 tells us that Jesus is the exact representation of God, then anything that we think about God that we got from anywhere, including the Old Testament, anything we think about God that doesn't look like Jesus is wrong. It's not that there's not different aspects to God's personality, it's that Jesus is the exact representation of the glory and radiance of God. So when you look at Jesus, and Jesus himself is saying, if you've seen me, then you've seen the Father, then you can't just wildly accuse God of being this vile and barbarous douchebag right after you watch Jesus raise somebody from the dead that he's never met because he sees and feels the grief of the family members while he's passing by the funeral. That makes God either very schizophrenic, or it means that there were facets and contexts to the obliterations and the various things that we see in the Old Testament that we're not reading, we're not registering. And it's not just with the Bible that we do this with people. Everybody's going to read different things. Everybody who reads the Bible is going to come up with different elements from the same stories. And that's all well and good. But the thing is, when you're talking with somebody about their own personal experiences, they are the ones who are the authority on that. You can come in and maybe augment things. You can help direct them to different conclusions in the midst of what they've experienced, but you can't rewrite history for them. You have to deal with them where they're at, and that's what God is doing and has done. That's why the Bible is written the way that it's written, because it was written to the people of the day. It's not that it doesn't still apply, but you can't eisegetically interpret the text. You have to exegete. For instance, in the Greek, when Peter is talking with Jesus after Jesus has come back, and Jesus is asking him repeatedly, Peter, do you love me? Every time the word love is used, it's a different Greek word. Hey, do you love me as your king? Do you love me as your God? And then do you love me even as a friend? So it's these knocks and the continual question that brings Peter to tears. It's not just that Jesus asked him 3 times. Jesus is the exact representation of God, and our assignment is to be like God, to be like Jesus. Any course of action that you want to take that doesn't look like Jesus is probably the wrong one to take. That way lies madness, or at least a really, really poor representation of the Father. As a believer, your first responsibility is a relationship with God. Your second responsibility is to love people well. I would suggest to you that correcting people and teaching them and all these other elements, they're not even necessarily your assignment, because your ministry is reconciliation, which is not counting the world's trespasses against them, which means if somebody doesn't understand something that you're bringing to the table, correcting them is not your first choice, not your first priority. Loving them is. But Ben, if someone's in a burning building, would you not pull them out? Sure. Are you the better fireman than God? No, you're not. You may be a really excellent fireman. You may legitimately be a fireman watching this video. I'm sorry that I knocked your fireman skills. If God's a fireman, he's better than you, because he's infinite and all-powerful, like we said before. It's logical. So my conclusion as we'll be moving forward is this. This is what I'm operating on. That God exists. That he came in the form of Jesus. He was fully God and fully man, and Jesus lined up to die for humanity because humanity made a big boo-boo way back in the day. And now Jesus is hanging out with his dad, until this place looks like home so we can come back. Oh, the amount of flack I'm going to get for this. It's really okay. So in summation, logical basis is very necessary. You need to know where the other person is coming from, even just out of respect. And you have to be willing to operate from the point that maybe you're wrong, because that allows for you to have the discussion with people rather than shout at them. I've been wrong plenty of times. If I die and nothing happens, I will have been wrong, and I suppose that no one will really know because I'm dead and can't tell them. But assuming that we're right, your responsibility is to represent God well, believers. And you can't do that by looking like anybody but Jesus.